morning, everybody. This is Alan Barton, and I'm currently in my living room. It's Holy Saturday, 2022. I nearly said 1522. It is 2022, and I'm sat here enjoying the sunshine coming through the window and drinking a cup of tea. Now, in this video, I am actually going to try to take us back to 1522 and leave my living room as I explore with you one of the important ritual actions of the late medieval English Holy Week, these ceremonies connected with the Easter Sepulchre. I'm going to look at those ceremonies in some depth. I'm going to think through how they originated. And lastly, I'm going to ask the question, is there actually any physical evidence within our English parish churches of how that ritual was performed? I do hope you enjoy the video.
First things first, and it's important to put the Easter Sepulchre ceremonies into their liturgical context, into the context of the liturgical calendar. The end of Holy Week, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday are a series of commemorations of particular events in the life of Christ. Those 3 days, known as the Triduum, are the most solemn in the Christian year. Maundy Thursday, from the Latin mandatum, command, commemorates two things. Firstly, the Last Supper, the institution of the Holy Eucharist, and secondly, Christ's command to his disciples to serve one another, represented by the washing of the feet. Maundy Thursday ends with the arrest of Christ. On Good Friday, the liturgical focus is on the Passion of Christ and the desolation of his crucifixion and the cross. Holy Saturday's focus is Christ's descent into Hades to release Adam and Eve and all the captive souls there. The ceremonies of these great 3 days were complex and multi-layered, a solemn preparation for the great feast of Easter, Pascha. And on Easter morning, of course, the great day of Pascha arrives and the celebration of Christ's resurrection. The one element that connects all 3 of those days within the Triduum of Holy Week, the great 3 days, is this object called the Easter Sepulchre. If you stepped into an English parish church on Holy Saturday 1522 and headed east towards the chancel and into the chancel, you would see there an awful lot of activity taking place. And on the north side of the chancel, you'd have seen a large structure, the Easter Sepulchre, that represented the tomb of Christ. Our ceremonial understanding of the use of the Easter Sepulchre comes from the liturgical books of the use of Sarum, the rites associated with Salisbury Cathedral. But as the Sarum use is the ubiquitous liturgical usage of late medieval England, we can assume that in general terms what happened in a parish church followed what was described in those books, though with perhaps a few adaptations. Painting a picture in reasonably broad brushstrokes, because I want this to be a manageable video this evening and not too long, this is in general terms what seems to have occurred. The ceremonial associated with the Easter Sepulchre begins on Maundy Thursday with a Mass. And at the Mass of Maundy Thursday, 3 hosts are consecrated. One for that Mass itself, a second for a Mass of the pre-sanctified gifts on Good Friday, and a third for use in the Easter Sepulchre. On Good Friday morning, after the singing of the office of nun, a ceremony called the Adoration of the Cross, which was more commonly called in England the creeping to the cross, occurred. The veiled cross on the altar is unveiled, is laid on a cushion, and priest, clergy and people reverence and kiss it. After a liturgy of the priest-sanctified gifts, the cross is then washed and then is wrapped in linen, and it and the remaining host are taken ceremoniously to the Easter Sepulchre and are there interred. And there they remain until the morning of Easter Day, and the people undertake a vigil in front of it. On Easter morning, the host is taken out of the Easter Sepulchre and is taken back to the high altar, where it is then placed in its usual place of reservation, either a pyx or a sacrament house. It's the cross buried in the Easter Sepulchre that becomes the focus of devotion. It is ceremoniously taken out of the sepulchre and taken in procession. The liturgy and ceremonial of the Church is not, of course, simply handed down by the apostles from Christ. It is something that develops over a considerable period of time. In both the East and the West, the way the Church offered worship changed quite often in response to doctrinal shifts. The complex ceremonial of Holy Week develops over a 400-year period between the 10th and the 13th century, and only really begins to be fixed in the middle of the 13th century. The earliest evidence we have of Easter Sepulchre-like ceremonies comes from the middle of the 10th century, and from a document called Regularis Concordia. In the 10th century, under the aegis of St Dunstan, the English Church was beginning to sort of reform and tidy itself up. And one of the things it reformed and tidied up was the liturgy of Holy Week. In Regularis Concordia, which is essentially a Benedictine document, there is a burial rite on Good Friday, but the focus of the burial rite is the cross and not the host. The cross is adored, there's a sort of creeping to the cross. It's then buried, and then on Easter morning it's elevated. The whole focus of the liturgical action is on the cross, which stands in as a surrogate for Christ's body. The host is not involved at all. Begs the question, what changes? Why in the later medieval Easter Sepulchre ceremonies is the host involved? Well, what changes is the doctrinal understanding of the Eucharist, of the Mass. The Western Church develops its understanding of what occurs in the Eucharist, and the doctrine of transubstantiation is developed. And as we move into the 13th century, there is an increasing focus on devotion to the sacrament of the altar and to the host. In that developing doctrinal climate, it makes sense to add to the burial rite of the Easter Sepulchre the host as well as the cross. The host is added as a sort of afterthought, but it's the cross in the late Middle Ages, as we saw, that continues to be the focus of Easter Day as it was in the 10th century. These late medieval ceremonies are so very different to those of the Counter-Reformation Catholic Church. The emphasis is entirely different. In the Counter-Reformation Church, there is a sort of sepulchre ceremony, but it takes place on Maundy Thursday, with the sacrament of the altar being taken to an altar of repose. The host interred in the altar of repose is of course consumed on Good Friday, and then there is complete desolation until Easter Sunday. Churches are stripped entirely of their colour and their warmth. That's not the case in late medieval England. The Easter Sepulchre, with its candles blazing around it above the burial place of Christ with the cross and the host within, becomes a warm focus within the church building. And rather than being a sense of desolation, there must have been a sense of anticipation of the resurrection. And the Counter-Reformation Church, from the Mass of Good Friday through to Easter morning, the church is the centre of very little activity. But in the late medieval English church, the Easter Sepulchre ensures that the church remains throughout that period the focus of vigil, the focus of intense parochial activity. And because the Easter Sepulchre is such an important aspect of the parochial life of late medieval England, it becomes a major focus for artistic patronage too. So now I want to move on to look at the form of the Easter Sepulchre, its structure, how it was constructed, how it was embellished and adorned. It would appear that the vast majority of Easter sepulchres were temporary structures. Roger Martin of Long Melford, writing in the 1580s about his experience of worship there in the 1530s, has this to say about the Easter Sepulchre there. And in the choir there was a fair painted frame of timber to be set up about Maundy Thursday, with holes for a number of fair tapers to stand in before the sepulchre, and to be lighted in the service time, and sometimes it was set overwort the choir before the high altar, the sepulchre being always placed and finely garnished. At the north end of the high altar, between that and Mr. Clopton's little chapel, there in a vacant place of the wall, I think upon a tomb of one of his ancestors, the said frame with the tapers was set near. So I think what Roger Martin is describing here is a temporary frame that stands in front of the tomb of John Clopton. Now this tomb is between the high altar and the north chapel, and has an open space, an opening between the chapel and the chancel. And the frame with candles on it seems to have stood in front of that tomb, and was almost an entryway into the Easter Sepulchre, representing the entryway into the tomb of Christ. And presumably the cross and the Blessed Sacrament were placed on top of the tomb itself. We can assume that the scale of the structure was determined by the means of the particular parish. In inventories and wills of the 15th and 16th century, there are lots of references to sepulchres and their creation. Often they were of timber with painted cloths, and on some occasions women gave their best gowns to adorn the sepulchre. There are copious references in churchwardens' accounts of the 15th and 16th century to people being paid to set up and take down the sepulchre. The churchwardens' accounts of St Mary Redcliffe in Bristol refer to the purchase of a new Easter Sepulchre in 1470 made by a Master Kane. This item appears to have been made of timber and painted cloths, but was also mechanical too and had automaton in it. A new sepulchre gilt with gold and a sieve thereto. Item, an image of God Almighty rising out of the same sepulchre with all the ordnance that longeth thereto, that is to say, a lath made of timber and the ironwork thereto. Item, thereto longeth heaven, made of timber and stained cloths. Hell made of timber there too, with devils to the number of 13. Item 4 knights armed, keeping the sepulchre with their weapons in their hands, that is to say, 2 axes and 2 spears with 2 shields. Item 4 pair of angels' wings for 4 angels, made of timber and well painted. Item the Father, the crown and the visage, the Holy Ghost coming out of heaven into the sepulchre. So as Christ pops up out of this sepulchre, presumably that's what God refers to, the angels descend down into it. Must have been quite an extraordinary thing to behold. The whole thing is very theatrical. And these temporary Easter sepulchres made of wood, painted wood and timber and painted cloth, must have been like stage sets in effect. Do any survive? Well, no. They were ephemeral. They were all burnt and destroyed at the Reformation. The closest thing we have to one is this extraordinary object at Calthorpe in Yorkshire, a chest with a canopy over it. It has long been interpreted as a surviving Easter Sepulchre, but we don't know for certain that it was. Although the temporary structures have disappeared, we do have a lot of tombs and monuments like John Clopton's in Long Melford that provided part of the setting for the Easter Sepulchre or a support for it. Let's look at 2 examples of those. The first is at Hingham in Norfolk, and it's the towering monument to Thomas Lord Morley, who died in 1435 on the north side of the chancel. We don't know for certain that this was an Easter sepulchre, but it seems quite likely. There's a flat table tomb on which are monumental brasses which would allow something to be constructed upon it, and behind and around are kneeling figures of Lord Morley and his family, facing inwards. What are they kneeling to? There's something missing. The thing I think is missing is the receptacle in which the Sacred Host and the cross are buried on Good Friday. In late medieval England, there's a pecking order with respect to where you were buried in a church building, and proximity to the sacrament was the key. The places of prestige and honour were those closest to the altar and to the sacrament. What better proximity and what greater honour could there be than for your tomb to act as the base for the Easter Sepulchre, and for your grave to become symbolically the grave of Christ? There are lots and lots and lots of tombs from the 15th and early 16th century of this form or similar on the north side of chancels with a flat table tomb incorporated in them. Sadly, we'll never understand precisely how they functioned as part of the Easter Sepulchre, as all the ephemeral parts of the sepulchre have disappeared. In Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire, there are a whole series of monuments that have been interpreted for the most part as Easter sepulchres. The finest of these are to be found at Heckington in Lincolnshire and at Horton in Nottinghamshire. There's another one at Navenby in Lincolnshire too. These are not tombs of people who double up as Easter sepulchres, but appear to be purpose-built structures. They all follow more or less the same form. They are stone structures built against the north wall of the chancel. In the centre of them there's a little opening or edicule into which something was clearly placed, and around them is a variety of imagery. At Horton in Nottinghamshire, the back part of the edicule, which is rather large, has a representation of the resurrection of Christ. Around the base there are images of the soldiers guarding Christ's tomb. At Heckington, the edicule is smaller. Rather than the representation of the resurrection being within it, it is in fact above, with two angels sensing Christ as he rises. And below, again, images of the soldiers. On either side of the edicule, figures of St. Peter and the Marys visiting the tomb on the first Easter day. At Heckington, at Horton and Navenby, these objects form part of a suite of furnishings in chancels of the early 14th century. En suite with a sedilia, seats for the clergy, a piscina for the cleansing of the Eucharistic vessels, and accompanied, generally speaking, by the tomb of the rector who paid for the work to be completed. Generally, the tombs adjoin this structure slightly to the west in the north wall of the chancel. So, what are these furnishings? Well, the general interpretation from the late 18th century through to the present has been that these are Easter Sepulchres. They are permanent Easter Sepulchres. But a number of scholars of late have begun to question this. Now, the edicules on these furnishings are quite small, and a number of scholars led by Veronica Secoulas have recently argued that they are too small to take a cross for the burial rite of the Easter Sepulchre. I suppose that depends on how big the cross is. And instead, they have argued that these are intended to be a permanent representation of the tomb of Christ, and that they're probably not used in the Holy Week ceremonies of the Easter Sepulchre, but are rather sacrament houses used for the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament throughout the course of the year. That may well be, and I think I'm convinced that it probably is the case, but I don't believe that precludes them from being used in the Holy Week ceremonies. What might preclude that is if the sacrament is removed from the sacrament house only to be put back in again, but that's not the case. Those three hosts, remember, consecrated on Maundy Thursday, one consumed at the Mass on Maundy Thursday, one consumed at the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts on Good Friday. That third host is transferred on Good Friday from the altar. And then on Easter morning, the sacrament can just stay where it is. There's no reason why it necessarily has to be moved. When it is moved in the Serum use, it's moved very discreetly. It is not the sacrament that is the ceremonial focus of Easter morning, but the cross that is exalted and elevated and becomes that focus. So I think it's quite plausible to understand these furnishings at Horton and Heckington and Navenby as two things: both a permanent sacrament house used throughout the year, that is a focus of devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, but also an Easter Sepulchre. The evidence is simply lacking either way. So I'm going to hedge my bets on that and continue to call them sepulchres.
Thanks very much for watching. I want to say a very special thank you to all of you who have contributed donations to this channel over the course of the last couple of weeks. Thank you very much indeed. Everything you have donated will really help me improve my videos and my equipment. I particularly want to say thank you to Sebastian, to Andrew, to Christine, to Steve, to Natasha, to Andrew, to Kathy and Robert for your contributions. I'm really, really very touched and grateful for them. If other people would like to help me out and donate, at the end of the video there'll be some instructions to show you how you can do that on the channel. But to all of you, may I wish you and your families a very happy Easter. Thank you very much. Bye for now.
There are a couple of ways you can donate. One is to go to the PayPal Me. So if you go to the top bar of the page, you'll see a little button there you can click that says donate. That will take you through to my PayPal Me page. And if you go back again to the bar, there is a second icon for buy me a coffee there, and you can click through to that and you can donate through that, and even set up a monthly subscription if you'd like to. All those donations are really, really helpful in helping me improve the quality of the videos I produce. Thanks very much indeed.